Lori. Thank you for being here. My name is Isaac Galef-Brown. I'm the Director of Outreach and Program Development at Thinking Beyond Borders. So just kind of a brief personal introduction. I have a background in education. I was teaching in public schools for a while in and around Boston, where I live. Then I switched over to kind of leading programs for Thinking Beyond Borders for 2 years as a program leader before coming into this directorship position that I'm currently in. So that's a little bit about who I am, but let's talk a little bit about what we're going to be discussing tonight. So the purpose of this webinar is to share some general information about gap years, to really kind of uncover what they are, that process, as well as share some specific options and background into Thinking Beyond Borders programs, our organization, and what we have to offer, because there are a lot of different options out there. Before we really hop into all that, I'd love to just take a quick second to introduce my colleague Mariah, who's also joining us on this webinar tonight. She's the other co-host, and she is Thinking Beyond Borders Marketing and Admissions Coordinator.
Hi everyone, my name is Mariah, and I have traveled with some of TBB students last year with Isaac and fellow co-leader Kelly, so had some time in the field with students, and now I'm doing marketing and admissions like Isaac said. And so what I'm going to be doing is more on the back end. I'll be answering any questions that you have. So if you have any questions while Isaac is speaking during this webinar, feel free to just type it into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and I will answer it either via message, or we will answer them all at the end as well. So type any questions you have during the webinar at the bottom, and then we will answer them collectively at the end. But until then, I will give it over to Isaac.
Cool. Thanks, Mariah. Well, great. So let's jump into things. So let's just start talking about what we're going to be discussing tonight. So this is just a quick agenda I have of these various topics. As you can see, we're really going to jump into some broad questions right off the bat. What is a gap year? Who are the folks that are taking them? From there, we're going to go into a bit more specifics around the planning process and how to actually choose from all these different options that are available to you out there. We're going to touch on some of the financials and cost aspects of what these programs can look like. And at that point, we're going to transition to talk a bit more specifics about program offerings of Thinking Beyond Borders, simply because I think it would be helpful to better understand what one specific example of a gap year can look like out there. Of course, acknowledging that there are a huge variety of options, and this is really only one of them. So to start off with that really broad central question, what is a gap year? And I'll begin by saying that gap year is actually a really widely accepted model in many other parts of the world, including Europe and Australia. And it's slowly becoming more accepted in the United States, but it's still kind of a scary concept for a lot of people out there, partially because of the lack of understanding of the benefits surrounding it, and also because it just feels like stepping off that traditional path of moving directly from high school onto higher education or a career right after that. What I share with students when I speak with them at college fairs, school visits, things like that, are that by the time you graduate from high school, you will have been learning within a classroom setting for 12 straight years of your life. If you go straight on to college after that, that's 16 straight years of your life learning within a classroom. And to be perfectly clear, I say that not because I have anything against formal education. I used to work in it. We encourage our students to pursue higher education afterwards if they're interested in doing so. But instead, because I think it's important to recognize the limitations to the learning environment and the process that happens within a classroom, where you're trying to balance the needs of a lot of different learners simultaneously. So a gap year is essentially a chance to step out of that specific learning environment within formal education to take a structured, intentional break from formal education. I'm going to make one thing really clear, which is that there's no one right way to do a gap year. In fact, I think there's actually only one wrong way to do a gap year, which is to view it as a vacation, right? And so there has to be some sort of structure or intention behind it. It has to be purpose. It's not just taking time off as a pure kind of vacation year. So it can be a semester or full year break within that formal education. Another thing I'd highlight in this opportunity is that it allows the opportunity for much more individualization to an extent that we typically don't see within the classroom. Which is to say that because there's such enormous variety of those different gap year options out there, a gap year can be tailored to your exact needs and goals. And we're going to discuss what some of those might look like later on in this presentation. But it's really just a period for you to think outside the box, to focus on you, exploring your passions, your interests, your potential, all of which I think have really enormous benefits and will set you up to do so much more with your next steps, whatever those may end up being. So who is taking a gap year? Who are these people who are kind of stepping off that traditional path and exploring a lot of these different options? Um, well, I speak with hundreds of different people who are interested in exploring these options every single year. And I'll start off by saying there is no one archetype student or individual who takes a gap year. They come from all different backgrounds. They're coming to this gap year model for all kinds of different reasons. For the purpose of this, I think it might be helpful just to kind of share a couple different categories that I like to put some of these folks in. And I'll start off with the formal education burnout category. So folks in this category, some of them really excelled in high school. Others really struggled to be engaged learners for a variety of different reasons. But regardless of the reason, they all ended high school feeling really burned out of that formal education environment. And I want to make one really crucial distinction here. These folks are burned out from schooling, not of learning. And so all that is to say, there's still a really high level of interest in learning and making the most use of your time on your gap year, but they just want it to be in a different setting and environment from what they're used to in formal education. They're tired of performing for grades, for the teachers to get into the next step of their education. They want their learning to be about something more than that, that's more authentic and true to who they are and what they're interested in doing. There are also folks that fall into this kind of general exploration category. So these folks kind of just want to get out of their bubble. They're looking for excitement, novelty, sometimes a bit of adventure in that as well. And again, it's about kind of getting out of that classroom environment and experiencing the world. There are also folks that are kind of more focused on self-growth and personal challenge. So perhaps they didn't feel fully ready for college. Perhaps they wanted time to practice some self-discovery or work on a variety of different things during that time on their gap year. Which leaves us with this final category, which I call specific area of focus. And it can mean a number of different things. Sometimes people have already identified something that they're really naturally passionate about or perhaps want to pursue later in higher education. Could be education itself. Maybe it's something like environmental science or public health. What we really commonly see on gap year programs is folks interested in learning languages, because we know that traveling abroad and those immersion components are perhaps some of the best ways to learn that language. So all this is to say there's really no single individual that comes to us. We get a really wide variety of students that are all looking for some way to fill that time between high school and moving on to the next step. Oops. So next, we're going to kind of unpack this process, right? Because there's so many different options out there, I think this process of determining and planning your gap year can be a little daunting to some folks. So our goal here is really to unpack it and kind of boil it down to 5 essential steps that are needed in planning out your gap year. And so some of these are going to be a bit more self-explanatory than others. But again, if you have any questions, feel free to type them out to Mariah and we can go through them at the end as well. So step 1, I would typically say this is probably the most important step out of the entire planning process. I will, kind of talk about my education background here. That's my implicit bias. In education, we have this concept called backwards design. And what I mean by that is that as a teacher, if you're planning out a unit or a lesson, you want to first identify where you want your students, what are they going to be taking away from your lesson, and what are your individual goals for your students? Where do you want them to go? From there, you then work backwards to identify a pathway to arrive at that goal. I think this same backwards design concept applies to planning your gap year as well. So I think you can think about that process in terms of 2 different questions, right? So the first one is identifying what your personal goals are for this time in your life. So where do you want to go? What do you want to gain out of this experience? It's really crucial that you start with these questions because, again, we know this is such an individualized process. From there, there's a really crucial second question to ask, which is, what will it take to get you to that goal, to achieving what you want to get out of this time? And there are a number of things you need to really think about. There are a number of different options for gap years out there that are entirely independent. And so it's really just kind of you out on your own path. Some of them might take you into a job or something like that. And others might have a variety of different levels of support and structure to them as well. So it's important to kind of consider all these things when you're thinking about what do I need as an individual to get me to where I want to go on my gap year. So after that, it's time to apply and defer from college. And this is a really, I think, daunting part of the process because folks don't understand that the timeline can actually look quite similar, if not the exact same, to people who are actually going straight on to college and skipping a gap year entirely. So what we encourage students to do is, in their starting perhaps in their junior, sometimes senior year of high school, is start the same application process to higher education as other folks are going through. So applying to colleges, once you get into school that you're comfortable with and excited about going to, that's when you might start the deferral process if you want to take a gap year. What I mean by a deferral process is reaching out to that school and saying, I'm happy to accept your offer of admission, but I would like to postpone my enrollment in your school for 1 year. So if you were doing that this year, you would not be attending the school in fall of 2020, but fall of 2021 instead. A couple things to point out here are that most colleges will allow students to take a gap year, and they actually sometimes really encourage it. Harvard is a really notable example of that. They love students who have taken gap years. But you typically you should avoid mentioning that you're planning on taking a gap year in your college application itself, simply because you want to come across as a really invested and interested applicant in the school. So after you go through that process, and the final thing I'll mention there actually is that it is possible to apply to schools while you're traveling. The reason we encourage you to do it in your senior year of high school is because of the myriad of resources and supports available to you within the school itself. Whereas sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to do that same process while you're traveling abroad with all the limitations that can have. So step 3 is actually creating a list. This one might be a bit more self-explanatory than the others. There are a couple good questions to ask, including this one here. So, what's going to leave you feeling excited, fulfilled, and then of course ready for another David when you're actually thinking about how you want to be spending your time on your gap year. But it's around this point where you want to kind of develop a list of what the different options are out there that might match those initial goals that you set for yourself. And so there are a number of different websites that can really help with that search. The first one I point out to a lot of folks who are interested is the Gap Year Association website. And so they have a number of different programs listed that are both accredited and non-accredited. You also have websites like Go Abroad, Go Overseas, Abroad 101. Again, these are just kind of general search engine websites for gap year programs. But you can enter specific criteria having to do with destination, itinerary, program length, cost, specific program focus, all these things really with the goal to kind of narrow down your search to your top 2 or 3 programs. So that brings us to step 4, doing your research. And so there are a couple things that I would mention in this step of the process. There are a lot of really important questions to ask, but really the goal of this step is to gain a more in-depth understanding of those 2 or 3 programs that you selected at this point. So what are they about? What kind of work do they do? Why do students typically choose that program? And what is the experience actually like? So there are a number of questions that I think are really important to ask on the right side of your screen here. But then there's 3 groups of people on the left-hand side. You have your admissions team, your director of programs. These folks have typically a really intimate knowledge of the program itself and can share really easily what you need to know to both become a part of this program and prepare for it as well. I would single out alumni as the single most important group of people to discuss when you're doing your research, for a couple of reasons. One is that they have no stake in the process, right? They're not trying to sell you anything. They're not trying to roll you in a program that might not be a good fit for you. But they've also been there and done that, right? So they've been in your exact shoes. They've gone through this process. So you can ask them, why did you select this specific program? And then, of course, they've been on the program itself. So you can ask them about the day-to-day experience that students have on these programs and ultimately what they took away from it. That perhaps might be the single most important question to ask, because then you can see whether it aligns with what you're hoping to get out of your gap year as well. And that brings us to step 5. So dealing with those details. At this point, hopefully you've narrowed down that search, perhaps to the top 2 programs. And now it's time to start applying to those different programs. So most gap year programs out there will have some sort of brief online application that you can fill out on their website, followed by some sort of interview process after that. Sometimes it'll be just a student interview. Sometimes there'll be an additional parent interview as well. Typically, there are a number of different financial aid forms that you can fill out, which I'll discuss a little bit later on this process, what those can look like. After that, it's the decision-making time, right? So you need to narrow it down to your top choice, whichever one you think best aligns with your initial goals that you set. And now it's time to actually enroll in that program. So typically, that's reaching out to the program. It's going to be completing some paperwork that officially says, I'm interested in this program and I will be enrolling. Most of the time, you'll be putting down an enrollment deposit as well. And that brings us to the final step of onboarding, which is really just preparing for that next step in your journey. So that is, of course, packing, which can be a huge challenge in itself. But beyond that, it can be a number of kind of hidden things that you might not have thought much about, like vaccinations. Sometimes you might have to renew your passport and get new visas, so you want to ask those questions up front, depending on where you're traveling to. The final thing I would mention about this entire process is that you're going to want to reach out to the organization early to understand if they do have any application deadlines. So most gap year programs out there, like some schools these days, operate on a rolling admissions basis, which means you can really start this process as soon as you want. And that's what I typically encourage people to do because it allows you to have more time through the planning stages. There are, of course, those deadlines because you need time to actually prepare and do that onboarding. So it's important to reach out to the organization and figure out exactly what time you're working with. And that brings us to financials. So, a lot at this point in the process, when I'm speaking with people about gap year programs, they say, Isaac, great, like this program sounds amazing, but what does it cost, right? Is this program actually affordable? Is it actually gonna work for me? And I think there are a couple important things to mention when it comes to the cost of these gap year programs. The first is that gap year programs span a whole spectrum of costs, right? And so they're shorter programs, they typically tend to be cheaper, but they also sometimes contain little support, structure, and sometimes don't lead to a meaningful experience. And those are really important things to take into account on top of the price tag. There are, of course, much more expensive programs as well, but it's also worth trying to figure out what is exactly that you're paying for, because sometimes they have a lot more built into them in terms of support and structure. Ultimately, when you're looking at this field, you tend to get what you pay for. So again, I urge you to look more at value than the initial price tag and kind of figuring out what's included in those program fees and what's not. The other two things I would mention about finances when we're coming to gap year programs is that, like most colleges and universities out there, scholarships and financial aid are pretty available and commonly found within the gap year market. So sometimes these scholarships are needs-based, sometimes they're merit-based or work study, and then also sometimes they might support you in your own kind of independent fundraising efforts as well. The final thing I'll mention, college credit, is actually a new addition to the gap year industry. And it's a really exciting one for a couple of reasons. So the first is that it changes the value of your gap year program. So if you can take a program and elect that college credit option, so you're earning college credit on your gap year, typically you can then transfer that credit back to any school that you've deferred from that you're going to be attending after your gap year. So that really changes the value of what that upfront cost is. The second reason it's an exciting development is because it allows families to apply 529 education funds, which previously were only available for their accredited higher education institution, like a college. Now you can use those funds for your gap year tuition as well. So it kind of just frees up those funds and it makes them more accessible than they've ever been before. All right, so at this point, I'm going to transition a little bit. Hopefully that was just kind of some helpful general information about gap years and what that process of selecting the right program for you might look like. At this point, I think it might be helpful just to provide one kind of concrete example, again, out of the many examples out there, of what this gap year could look like. So I work for Think Beyond Borders. We were founded in 2007. And we're a gap year organization with the mission to empower students through education to address critical global issues. So what I mean by that is that we push our students to dig deep, ask really tough questions of the world, of ourselves, to gain really kind of deeper levels of understanding of these really complex and sometimes nuanced issues, instead of seeing them as single-dimensional problems and attempting to apply solutions to them as such. So what makes us different from some of these other options? This is kind of the question you should be asking throughout the research process of what distinguishes all these different options? How do I tell them apart? Because that sometimes can be difficult to do. When people ask me this question about Thinking Beyond Borders, I typically have a couple different answers for them. The bottom line from the way I see it, when I joined this organization, this is what stood out to me, is that at TBB, we're serious about what we do. Which is not only that big picture that I just shared with you, that mission of kind of preparing students for lives full of meaningful impact, but it's also about providing students with the intentional space and support to become engaged, lifelong learners who are more self-confident, self-aware. They have those cross-cultural fluencies from traveling abroad. but they're also able to ask tough questions of themselves and the world. And this sets them up for success in whatever their next step is, whether it's higher education, any type of major, any type of career. These are kind of broad capacities that will help you with whatever those next steps are going to be for you. So what makes us different is that literally every aspect of our program and all these components that we have in place are put together to ensure that our students make the most of their time abroad and get to those outcomes. So kind of going back to that whole concept, there is that backwards design, right? So we've identified where we want our students to go, what they want to get out of these programs. And then we put all these different components together to support them in that pathway to getting there. So it's not just a bunch of incoherent program components thrown together that might appeal to some people. But we actually have a comprehensive vision. We've honed our practice over the course of 12 years, in which time we specialize exclusively in gap year programming, no other types. So that's one of the, I think, the biggest differentiating pieces between Thinking Beyond Borders and others. Some of the more concrete pieces of that is that we have a really interesting holistic approach to education. So we approach it from two different angles, which make it a very different learning experience from the classroom that a lot of our students are familiar with. So we combine kind of a hands-on experiential learning piece with a discussion-based seminar space that's facilitated by our program leaders. And together those really create experience that is available and accessible to all different types of learners, whether you're somebody who's at the top of your class in high school or someone who kind of struggled to engage a bit more as a student. Those program leaders that I mentioned who are facilitating that seminar space, these are master's level educators. And so that's another really big distinguishing point. These are not camp counselors, they're not folks right out of college. These are master's level educators, they're serious about what they do, and they've taught in classrooms for a number of years before joining us on these programs. They're also beyond that, as a program leader, you have to wear a lot of different hats. Mentorship is another really big part of our programs, coming from those educators. So at the beginning of the trip, they actually will match up one-on-one with you as a student to start with that backwards design process, right? Of helping you as an individual, because we know gap years are all about the individual, identifying what you want to gain out of your time, and then on that one-on-one basis, helping you to get to where you need to go. So we're really serious about education. We're really serious about making sure our students get the most out of their time, because we don't want to view it just as education. Beyond that, though, we have that social impact focus within our curriculums that I mentioned. And then we have this really interesting deep immersion focus within our programs, which, most of what I mean by that is that there's kind of a language instruction component taught by local teachers, but there are also this extended homestay component. So for the majority of our programs, our students are living within a host community in another country, and they're actually living in the home of local families as well. A lot of other programs might have a similar component, but they tend not to be as long as ours. The minimum length homestay you would experience in a Thinking Beyond Borders program is about 4.5 weeks. And again, we do that because of backwards design and understanding where we want to go. The longer the homestay, typically, the more learning can happen, and that gives our students the opportunity to really develop genuine relationships with folks in other parts of the world to give you an understanding of, what is it actually like to live in this drastically different part of the world than the one I grew up in. So there are a number of different things that kind of make our programs different from some of the other options out there. This slide is really just to share a little bit about what a typical day might look like on one of our programs, of course, with the understanding that days are going to vary tremendously. You'll see overall that it's a pretty structured schedule, again, because we don't want this to be vacation. We want our students to really make the most out of their time. And we want them to have learning opportunities from the day, the second they wake up until the second they go to sleep at night. So there's a lot going on here. There's that hands-on component with fieldwork start in the morning, balanced off by seminars. You get to do some small group research opportunities and learn new languages. In the evenings, you'll see there's a lot of time spent with your homestay family and that immersion component, but there's also a lot of really fun stuff we get to do on the program too. And so you get to go on excursions and cultural activities. Maybe it's a short hike or a ceramics workshop. And then the culmination is another distinguishing piece of Thinking Beyond Borders. All TBB programs wrap up in Washington, D.C., and we get to tour our town, and our students get to actually go on Capitol Hill and lobby with their political representatives on issues that they are really, truly passionate about. All of this is just kind of a way of taking that learning that you experience while you're abroad and making it relevant to your life back home, which we know is an essential piece to this learning process. So I'm just going to quickly kind of run through these three different program options that Thinking Beyond Borders currently has. All three of these different options, we offer college credit options, and we also have a variety of different scholarship options available. We have work studies as well as needs-based financial aid for all these three different programs. And I'll start off with our Latin America Gap Semester program. This program is really popular for students who are interested in honing those language skills, especially Spanish. You'll see that all three countries that it visits outside of the United States are Spanish-speaking countries. And this is a semester program, right? So it's 3 months in length. We offer it in both the fall and the spring, depending on what you're looking for. There are two different curricular units, one on education, one on the environment. And the program fees are $14,500 for this trip. And so, just to kind of vaguely put that on the spectrum for you, there are certainly cheaper programs out there, but there are certainly many more expensive programs as well. So again, it's really about understanding the value behind that price tag and what you're getting for the cost. With Thinking Beyond Border programs, as you can see with that daily schedule, there's clearly a lot built in terms of structure and support that you're getting for that cost as well. The Asia Gap semester, in a lot of ways, is really similar to our Latin America semester, although, of course, in just a drastically different geographical context throughout the world. So it visits Thailand, Cambodia, and India before returning to the US. It's that same 3-month duration, both often in the fall and the spring, same curricular units, and same program fee as well. And that brings us to our Global Gap Year. So this is kind of our flagship program. This was actually one of the first 2-semester gap year programs offered in the United States. And so you'll see that this program is, as a whole, just kind of a more in-depth, it's a deeper dive of the semester programs. So it visits 7 countries over a course of 7 months. You're going to be visiting 3 different continents. So with the understanding that it's a bit less focused in a specific part of the world. But that extra time allows you to do a number of different things. One, there's an extra unit in there on public health as well. But from what I've seen of students in the past, when I've led these programs, these students just are able to get so much more out of their time because it's just a much deeper dive than a semester program could ever offer. So it depends on what you're looking for. It depends on whether you want to balance your semester off traveling with something else different at home, or whether you want to dedicate your entire gap year towards traveling abroad. It's really just about what you're trying to get out of that year and what you need to get there. So that's more or less all that I have from my end. At this point, it's time to start brainstorming your goals and needs. This is November. If you're a high school senior, this is around the time that you should probably be starting to think about what those next steps might be and what you need to get to those personal goals. It's time for research. There's so many different options out there, and there are plenty of good people to speak with if you have good questions. And then it's time to apply those programs, get to onboarding, and time to take off on your trip. So there's enormous potential within this gap year model. So I really encourage folks to reach out if they have any questions, and I'm available to answer them. So that's more or less I have from my end. But Mariah, do we have any questions at this point? I'd be happy to answer some.
Yes. I can't start my video back up, but here we go. So we have one question about group sizes. Can you talk a little bit about what a typical group size is, and does that vary from trip to trip? And is there a reason behind those group sizes?
Yeah, all great questions. There is a little bit of variety to it, but there's also kind of a general guideline that we have at Thinking Beyond Borders surrounding group size, which is to say that we put a cap on program cohorts. The most students that would be in one TBB program is going to be 18 students, with the fewest being probably around 7 or 8 students. The reason behind that is, again, kind of understanding that what we take really seriously what we do. We want it to be a really quality experience. We care a lot about kind of the ratio of students to program leaders. And so we're dedicated to a model that has at maximum 6 students to every program leader. So that being said, if you have a group of 18 students, there'll be 3 program leaders with that group, and then 12 or fewer students would be accompanied by 2 program leaders to that group. A lot of this, again, just kind of comes back to the individualization that we know is really important within the gap year model, and understanding that, for all those different individual needs to be met, we want to have smaller group sizes that can be more tailored to those needs. So it's one of the ways that we're able to operate outside of that formal education model and get students really quality programming that goes really in depth.
Awesome. Good. And then the last kind of big group question would be deadlines. Can you talk a little bit about deadlines, early application, when?
Ooh, yeah, fun stuff. Absolutely. Yeah, so we have a variety of deadlines because we have programs that depart at different times. And so this is a really great question to ask of any program you're applying to, because the deadline for a fall program typically will look different than a spring program might. So just to throw out an example, we have a spring Latin America gap semester program that is departing on February 8th of 2020. The final application deadline for that program is January 1st. So you'll notice that it's roughly a month out from program departure, which leaves enough time and window for you to prepare all those different documents and kind of get all your things together and ready for that trip. For our fall program, so that's our global gap year and any of the semester programs that leaves in the fall, that final application deadline is going to look similar, but it's going to be in August. So it's going to be August 1st. Typically for a departure that I think for 2020 is going to be on September 12th. So again, it's roughly a month and a half out from departure. Really the biggest part of that onboarding process is getting visas. And so some programs, depending on their itinerary, you won't need any visas. Others, you might need a couple. And we want to make sure you have enough time to do that. So those two big deadlines for TVB are January 1st for spring programs and then August 1st for fall programs.
Awesome. All right. Well, that is all we have for questions.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you everyone so much for taking the time this evening out of your busy schedules. Again, you can see my information on the screen here, so feel free to email me at isaac@thinkingonborders.org. We have our TVB phone line that you can reach us at as well, but you can also follow us on Instagram and Facebook. And that'll do it for the evening. So thank you so much, everyone, and have a good night.